Well, hello, folks, and welcome. It is midweek, and it is time for another Between Two Sundays. And I am here with my esteemed colleague, good friend, buddy, pal, Mark Beresford. How are you, my friend?
I'm really well. Really happy to be with my esteemed buddy, good pal, good friend, Mark Gladden, actually.
Oh, there you go. I know that guy. He's all right.
He is all right.
So it is Lent still. We are still in Lent.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this today. Lent is so much longer than Advent, and there's something about that that I think's important. We wait 4 weeks for the Christmas nativity and story. We sit around for just over 6 weeks in Lent, which maybe there's something in that. I don't know. I just think about that
really
today.
interesting. It's really interesting you say that, Mark. I find it probably harder to enter into Advent than I do to Lent, partly because those 4 weeks of December are just madness. You know, the way we do it, the way our society does it.
Yeah,
it's really packed time of year, isn't it? And it, if you're going to reflect and learn through a season like that, it has to be very, very deliberate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would suggest that Lent is probably more deliberate in that it asks for disciplines and, choices to be made at the beginning, and a little bit longer. So my gut feeling is we probably get more out of Lent.
Nice gut.
Maybe.
So last week we had our readings from Joshua, from Psalm 32, from 2 Corinthians, and from Luke. And we spent a lot of time chewing around some of those. I think the thing that stuck most with me, mate, was the story that the discussion we had out of Joshua, particularly where, while Israel was in the desert, they literally had food falling from the sky. Manna fell from the sky, quail fell from the sky. But as soon as they entered the promised land, this is the land that's been promised to them, but the falling from the sky stuff ceases. And it's almost like I've really been reflecting on about our participation in creation and our participation in the work of God in the world, which I guess that's a lot of what we spend thinking, should be a lot of what we spend our time thinking about in the season of Lent. But that story particularly drew that out of me. That and spending time reflecting on the older brother's story in the gospel and the parable of the prodigal son. The one that we don't spend a lot of time in. And I must admit, every time I read that story, I spend a lot of time with that particular son, as that particular son in the story, thinking about, well, here I am enjoying the blessings of being, and hear me right, it's not that I'm blessed and someone else doesn't have something. I think that when I talk about blessings, I mean the blessing of understanding and realizing that I have this connection with the divine, that I participate in the activity of God in the world, that I have this sense about me that I've been blessed with, to see and understand where God is in the way that we go about doing things. And it's important that I live my life in a way that shares those blessings with others, that helps others see the divine, that's helped others encounter the Christ of creation in the world, that helps other people engage with God. So there's this participation aspect, I suppose, that I've been really sitting with over the last week since we last chatted, and really thinking about what that participation looks like. I don't think it can be pat anymore. I don't think it can be just joining into activities and programs. I think there's a far more intentional lifestyle shift that I need to engage in and make this a conscious part of how I live into every day. So that's what I drew out of our nice long conversation from last week. 50 odd minutes of stuff that you can draw
Yeah.
from, I suppose. But what about yourself, man? Is there anything that's really stuck with you?
Not just out of the readings, but out of a number of conversations, some circumstances around my family this week, new beginnings and the challenges of them is actually sort of the theme the place that my mind has gone over the last week. Just realizing that while there's a tremendous sense of hope in this idea that things might be starting again, there's always that older brother who is, I just want things to stay the same.
Yeah.
And there's often a very deep uncertainty as we move into new seasons. While we may be tempted to, and I think I probably have, been tempted to emphasize the hope of new beginnings, there's actually a deep uncertainty that comes along with that. Change is rarely easy. And I'm surprised how many people over the last week I've actually run into who are in a season like this. Within my family, beyond my family, within the church, beyond the church. There's actually a number of people who've been saying, I'm moving with a sense of fear, maybe even with a sense of inevitability into a new season, but it's not making me brim with hope. I would like this to turn out well, but there's something that scares me about it. And I wonder if that's helped me relate a little bit to the older brother in that wonderful story Jesus told, that where we do emphasize the younger brother so quickly, but that older brother who is, has kind of got used to things without his younger brother there, and perhaps is left a little bit uncertain about, why is Dad behaving this way? What am I going to lose here? Am I going to lose even?
Yeah.
And I hope reflecting both on, the conversations I've had this week, but also on these readings, might make me just a little bit more sensitive to the changes people encounter and how unsettling that can be.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that that point that we discussed last week, that, in celebrating with the younger son, it's the older brother's inheritance that was being spent. It was his cow, it was his ring, it was his robe, it was his shoes,
That's right.
and his reaction to it. So that's a really good reflection point there too. That's really good. Well, that was Lent 4. We're booming through Lent and we're banging into Lent 5. Well, you can always go back and listen to the episode. They're always sitting there. You can go back and listen to them anytime. And if you, and it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe we're going to have a start of our show where we discussed last week, and I'm going to go one day, I need to go listen to what we talked about again. This might be one of those weeks, I sense. But anyway,
maybe.
So Lent 5, 5th week of Lent, 5th Sunday of Lent, and our readings for this week are Psalm 43, verses 16 to 21, Psalm 126. Sorry, did I say Psalm or Isaiah at the start there? It's Isaiah 43, verse 16 to 21.
Isaiah 43, yep.
Psalm 126, Philippians 3, verses 3 to 14, and then John chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. All of those are in the show notes, which are just below you if you're on YouTube, or back on the other screen if you're watching or listening rather on Spotify or any of our podcast hosting areas that we happen to be on. So yeah, I don't know where you want to start. If you wanted to start anywhere, I'm going to be honest and say that I spent a lot of time in the gospel.
I was about to place money on that.
Well, it's John for a start. And you know that while Mark used to be my favorite gospel, John sort of snuck ahead,
Yeah.
thanks to his deep
You're
mystical.
clearly much more spiritual than me, because I'm still.
But I'll tell you what really went down for me. This is what happened. This is why I spent a lot of time in John. First of all, this is a really, really well-known story where Mary breaks the flask of perfume over Jesus' feet, essentially anointing him for his burial and death before it's even happening. It's kind of a foreshadowing, I suppose, of what's to come. And it's interesting that in that time, she breaks that flask on his feet, and Judas reacts in a negative way, saying, if we'd sold that, we could have, used the money to give to the poor. And John takes the time to point out that Judas wasn't saying that because he cared about the poor. He's saying that because he wanted to pocket some of the dosh, which is interesting. But then, Jesus says to him, "No, leave it be, let it go." And there was something really, I guess, important that I'd never noticed before that seemed to come out of the story. This is an incredibly public display of affection. I mean, this is happening now. This is happening inside a house. But remember that when someone of the stature of Lazarus was having a meal with someone of the stature of a rabbi like Jesus, it was quite common in those days that one of the things you'd do after dinner is you'd go for a walk and see who was eating dinner with who. And a lot of the time, while things took place in a house, it was done in a way where people could literally watch and observe and be an audience, if you like, to what was going on. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were people watching this happening. And at the very least, even if they weren't, Mary would have known that someone could have rocked up to have a good look at what was going on any time. A well-known rabbi and a very esteemed man in the community were having a meal together. Someone was likely to come up and have a look. And yet, despite the public setup of this thing, she takes the time to do this display of affection and love, which is incredibly intimate. And so you have, I'm just pulling the gospel up here as we speak. You have this happening, and it's she's spilled this perfume on his feet, and she's wiping them with her hair, which is also a very sensual act. There, so there's this sensuality and intimacy here. This love that's being displayed from Mary towards Jesus. And what really dawned on me was the publicness of this whole scenario, that it was not a hidden thing. And it's interesting that love in our world today, unless there's something that can be gained from declaring it, is a very private act. We've kind of, in some ways, commodified love so that it becomes this this very private, intimate thing that we don't share with other people very much. The isolation, particularly, that we've seen happen, even before COVID, there was, a lot of people were a lot more isolated, a lot more lonely people. And so you have this privatization of relationship, this privatization of things that's going on. And yet this is a very public display of private affection. And it's easy to look at this and see the reaction of Judas and say, well, is Judas saying, it would have been right for us, even if, forget that Judas wanted the money, it would be easy to go, well, Judas is right. It would be better to sell this, give the money to the poor, or, help some widows or orphans or whatever else we want to do with these funds. She's wasted this in this act. But what's incredibly poignant about it is that she's actually doing what's expected of a disciple in that moment. That it's not just expected, but accepted, not by Jesus, but by others who are in the room. Lazarus doesn't say anything. The only person who seems to have objected is Judas. So there's this this giving of this love, which is an act of discipleship, and so much so that Judas seems to have lost the plot a little bit on what it means to be a disciple. He would say, even again, forget about the money issue. He would say the right thing for us to do as disciples and followers of Jesus is to sell this and give the money to the poor. Jesus seems to indicate that an extravagant act of love is a legitimate act of love and affection from the disciple towards a master, a teacher, a rabbi. So that really stood out. Thinking about, first of all, the public display that this affection is, but also thinking about the acceptability of it and what that says about my actions, not in judging my actions, but I guess in looking at what they say about my relationship with Jesus and whether they are intentional actions of a disciple, that my actions are out of love for the rabbi as opposed to out of servitude to his words alone, if that makes sense. So I'm going to kick the ball back to you for a moment and just sit on this for a second, but that's where I've started off.
I really like where you've started there. There is, and this is one of those, this is one of those passages where Jesus defends the poetry or the beauty or the symbolism of someone else. And make no mistake, this symbolism is very, very significant. So there are a couple of things here that indicate, I think, that that this is the Lamb of God. Okay, so 6 days before the Passover, when all the lambs were executed, they would remember they needed a pure lamb, so they would actually anoint with oil the feet of the lamb 6 days before. 2 days before, they would anoint the head of the lamb. So there's other echoes of this story in other Gospels that talk 2 days and the head. In John here we have 6 days and the feet. This indicates Jesus is ready to face death. So there's this symbol here at the beginning of this story that's given quite apart from Mary, really, or the timing should make us, certainly make the Jewish mind think there's something very significant going on here. The other thing that really strikes me about this story is we are in the midst of the journey of the disciples to Jesus has been saying over and over again, I'm going to suffer, die, and rise again. No one has got this. No one in this story has understood it except Mary. She has. I look, on some level, she has gone out. She has purchased, found the money, purchased this ointment, and she is probably the only person in this story so far, maybe the only one who does it at all, who is preparing for Jesus' prophecy to come true. And I find that breathtaking. Honestly, all the men, well, Judas here, who's, worried about the poor. Now, I'm all for worrying about the poor, and quite frankly, the Gospels and the New Testament are all for it as well. So this is a terribly abused passage when it comes to, we'll always have the poor amongst us. We can spend our money however we want, which, quite frankly, this passage has been abused in that direction. Is alarmingly selective. The New Testament is radically for the poor and for generosity. So very sad to see that used in this direction. But, as far as I can see, Mary is the only one who has listened to Jesus teaching that he is going to suffer, die, and rise again. And not only does it seem that she's the only one to listen to that, she is the only one to act on it. And I think that is so beautiful. That number one, that she's a woman whose life in these times has taught her humility, whether she's liked it or not. And I'm not justifying that, but she comes out of this this very powerless kind of space, and here she puts all the power she has in the direction of, well, if Jesus said it, I'm going to act on it. Even if I don't understand it, even if I don't want it to happen. She seems to me to be the only one who's heard it.
Jumping out of this reading a little bit, just for a moment, is it any wonder then that she is the first person after the resurrection commissioned to go and preach?
Yes,
she gets it. And that's why.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And just how, I hear people, arguing that, that there seems to be almost a tradition, which is slightly alarming, really, in the Gospels of highlighting the men seeing the resurrected Jesus. But still in these stories, it's the women who see first.
Yep.
It's the women who are there responding to the reality. They're filled with as many doubts as anyone, of course. But they are the ones who see first. There's this really special place for these women in this story. And it really is very radical, and of course evidence that the Gospels are pretty true to what happened. They're trying to stick with what happened, because you just wouldn't in this culture found the evidence for the resurrection on a woman, on a woman's testimony, if you were trying to convince people of this, within the culture. It seems to me to be such, to be one of those moments that really points to the genuineness of this story, that they're as amazed as anyone else. And you just wouldn't write it this way. If you were making it up, you just wouldn't write it this way.
Exactly.
And I think this story that we're looking at this week is another one of those stories. If you were writing this to convince the culture, and you were inventing this, you wouldn't have Mary as the one who heard what Jesus was saying first, who responded to it first. You'd make Peter one of those heroes, or John one of those heroes. But the Gospels aren't like that. They're so upside down and throwing us off balance, challenging to our cultures. You can see why in the Western world that is, whether we like it or not, founded on these stories, you do end up with movements that say, actually, there's a place for all of us at God's table. We're going to fight for equality for men and women, for those who are in the main culture and those who are out of it. There is this beautiful story that says we all matter.
And it's a very vulnerable act on her part. Not just because it was public, but also because she is a woman. She's pulled her hair out. This is all stuff that's incredibly provocative in terms of how people would have reacted to it, and since it's there. But what's really interesting, and again, outside of the readings for this week, but of course, like good preachers, we always read around it, right? Something that I'd never noted before. Just after our reading finishes for the week in verse 8, in verse 9 and 10 and 11, we're told that, I'll read it, when a great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there. Well, there you go. Here comes the crowd that I was talking about. They are there, not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So you got this prominent man in the community who they know has been raised from the dead. Jesus is there, and they're like, let's go check it out. They rock up, they see this woman on the floor, expensive bottle of perfume cracked open, hair down, rubbing his feet, highly provocative in a sexual way in that community. And then verse 10, so the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. So here's this meal that's happening. You've got Mary, who's cracking open expensive bottles of perfume and letting her hair drop and anointing Jesus and getting it and showing this very intimate and public display of affection. Then you've got Lazarus, who has a little bit of fame because he's the dude that was dead and now he's not. The guy that raised him from the dead's there with him. But it's interesting, John states quite emphatically, it's because of that Lazarus was in line to be put to death as well. Now, and I totally missed that in the past, but there it is again. This, Mary is in danger of being stoned for what she's doing. She's coming very close to the line if she hasn't crossed it. Here's Lazarus, who may or may not know, but out of the very fact that he's associating with Jesus, it's not his fault that Jesus resurrected him. And yet the chief priests are going, we need to knock this guy off because we're losing our own followers. Understanding, of course, that the chief priests that we're talking about here were for a particular sect of Judaism. This is not all Jews. This is not a blight on Jews. This is not anti-Semitic in its statement, although, the way it's translated in English could probably use better terminology. But this is some people who have become very, very fragile in their position of things because people are starting to listen to the teaching of Jesus out of the testimony of the fact that Lazarus is listening. And so they go, not only do we have to kill Jesus, we're going to have to knock Lazarus off too, which made me think about, well, am I prepared, like Mary and like Lazarus, to be put in a position where I could be maligned? I don't think, being a white male in the world that I'm in, that I have much danger of persecution in the way that so many other people, because of their sexuality, because they're women, because of their race and culture. I don't have those. I'm certainly not going to say that I have those issues. Those people have it way worse and are far more persecuted than I will ever be, without even trying. But I do ask myself, would I be willing to put myself in a position where I could be misunderstood, where I could be told you're a heretic. Happens all the time anyway. Where I could be shoved to the side, where I could be told, we're going to put you on the fringes. We don't want to associate with you. Excommunication, whatever that means, not necessarily from a church, or maybe from a church, maybe from a group of people. Lose my job because of standing up for truth. Am I prepared for that? Am I prepared to do that? Because he was a man and a woman who were prepared to do that. And in this time of Lent, where we're thinking about what it was that Jesus was willing to suffer for truth, let's face it, Jesus stood for truth. He stood for what it really meant to encounter God, to be at one with the divine, to walk in the presence of God in the world, and was saying to people, you have access to that. You have the ability to connect with that. The kingdom of God's within you. It's among you. It's around you. It's with you. You don't have to do all this other stuff that you've been on about. It's simply, you can be who you've been created to be and in whose image you've created to be. They were willing to kill him for that. Lazarus was willing, or was it putting himself on the line simply by playing party to that? Mary was being put in a predicament, a predicated position anyway, because of what could have happened to her, out of showing her love and affection for understanding and getting that, as you pointed out. Where do I sit in all of this? It's an incredibly powerful story with so much depth. And I guess particularly based on, what we were sharing before, that we bring from last week, that idea of, if I'm participating in God's work in the world, it's a very public display, not to be showy and not to say, hey, look at me, aren't I wonderful? But the simple act of, I remember, as simple as it sounds, I think it was Shane Claiborne in Philly. They took pizzas to a whole bunch of homeless people who were living in the skate park, or near the skate park where they live in Philadelphia. And the police arrested them because it's illegal, or the mayor or something like that had made it illegal to feed people who were on the street. To buy food and take it to people who were on the street was an illegal act. And they were all arrested, every single last one of them. They all had to go to court. In the end, the judge threw it out, which is a whole other story. But,
Wow.
would I be prepared to do what shouldn't be a radical act of love, but certainly in our world today would be deemed that? Would I be willing to be snided at because I bothered to sit on the steps with a homeless guy and have a cup of coffee? And I'd like to think that I am, and I'd like to think my past actions show that I am. But I always need to question that, because I'm sure there's times when I've gone, now's not the time for this, not because it was the wrong time, but because it would have put me in a Lazarus Mary type position.
I wonder, both these characters, Lazarus and Mary, the way the story's told, I find myself thinking, Lazarus is just giving his testimony. He's just telling what happened. I think he's amazed and as amazed and baffled by it as anyone else. And certainly everyone is. The description here is miracle. That's sort of, or sign in the Gospel of John. That's the terminology being used here. I think I think Lazarus has just been pointed in this direction. I think Mary has read the signs, listened to what Jesus is saying, and she is overcome with grief. And there's something in me that thinks neither of these people are doing this to get in trouble.
No.
They're not.
It's not a radical,
It's not like the fear has. I don't think the fear has even clicked in. They may not even be aware of the danger what they're doing is they're responding to God's grace.
Yeah.
And this is open. They don't want to hide this. They're just responding. And I think wherever there's persecution here, it's kind of it's secondary. It's the result of them being faithful, rather than something they're planning for necessarily, or thinking, you know, if I say this, this will happen. I don't think it's quite as figured out as that.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more spontaneous, and certainly Mary's display, as we've talked about here, if it is the case that she's the only one who's been listening, you know, I think she's filled with grief already.
Oh,
just
yeah,
at the thought of this one not being around.
Which actually is found in the other readings. So in the Philippians reading, Philippians 3, verses 4 to 14, we have Paul saying, I want to know Christ, in verse 10, and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. So here's this participation with, again, but it's a participation in suffering. You know, at the end of the psalm, which is that, you know, that famous bringing in the sheaves. But when you read that psalm, and this psalm is in I think it's the terce office in the traditional Benedictine, the office, the third hour prayer at mid-morning. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. So they've had their fortunes restored. But then verse 5, may those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. So there is joy, but tears come first. Is it Isaiah? Tears endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. So, you know, we do have this time of identifying, and it's not identifying out of, oh, Jesus is, you know, the person I'm following, so I'm going to identify, I'm going to experience what he experienced just so I can say, hey, I know, I get what it means. I think it's much more deep than that. I think, you know, participating in the suffering means participating in his passion. And when I say his passion, I'm not just talking about carrying a cross up the hill and being nailed to it. I'm talking about his, you know, when we talk about a passion, we're talking about something we love, something that we're passionate about, that we want to do. And Jesus' passion was that people would love God and love their neighbor as they love themselves. And so we participate in the suffering by participating in that passion with Jesus, by helping people understand who God is, where they can connect with God and how they can connect with God, so they too can love God and love their neighbor.
I love where you've taken that, Mark, and I think there's a bit of a circle happening here. Passion, of course, are those things you're willing to suffer for. That's what passion originally means. So you can see how Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection was called the Passion of Christ. You know, this is what Jesus is willing to suffer for. But, you know, maybe this is the kind of language that can be helpful in our discussion before around Lazarus and Mary as well. Lazarus wants to tell his testimony, and he just seems to be willing to suffer for this. This is important enough. I'm not going out looking for suffering. I'm not going out looking for bad things to happen for me. But this truth, this reality is worth sharing. And Mary's doing the same thing here. She is responding to what she is hearing from Jesus, unlike anyone else, and she is willing to go on public record, so to speak, as one who has listened and is taking it seriously. And you know, who knows what happens from here for her? But she is going to show that she has heard and is responding with grief even before it happens.
Yeah.
This is another instance of passion. What am I willing to take the risk for? This is important enough for her. She will make this public act, and she'll take the risk of this.
I think it's important. Sorry, go, you go.
I was just going to say, there's, you know, we've said so in tears and weeping from that psalm there. This is so clearly in the gospel reading for this week. We so clearly have one who is weeping over what she has, and from the Isaiah reading, it's what she's perceived. This beautiful question that sits in the middle of this Isaiah reading: I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I want to argue that Mary has perceived it.
Yeah, yeah.
She has seen something everyone else has missed. And understandably, I mean, you know, Jesus is famous, he's popular, everyone loves him. He walks around with the guy next to him who he raised from the dead. You know, how could things possibly go wrong? But this is so new. How could things possibly go in the direction of Jesus suffering, dying, and rising again? Yet Mary perceives it, and it might cost her tears before anyone else. But there is something wonderful about the faith that she displays as she breaks this perfume and enacts what everyone else has refused to even hear.
Yeah. But I think what I was going to say, and which brings me to that very point, it's not as if, as you mentioned before, Lazarus and Mary have gone out of their way to get into trouble. On the contrary, all they're doing is what they know is right in responding to this truth that they've become aware of. And I think that's what I was talking about before. I wasn't talking about these radical showy acts of, oh, well, you know, the law says this, so we're going to go out there and rah, rah, rah. You know, I'm talking about, well, if we're going to respond in truth, look, if the law says don't feed someone and someone's hungry, I'll slip them a burger.
Sure.
And it certainly wasn't a case of the guys from Simple Way. No, the guys from Simple Way weren't trying to get thrown in jail.
No, of course not.
And in fact, if I understand the story right, they may not have known that it would have resulted in the way that they thought it would. They were simply doing what they thought was right. There was no fanfare. There was no ringing up the media. There was no public statements. It was simply, we've gone past the pizza shop, we'll buy some pizzas, drop them to the homeless people, and the police happened to show up. So, and I think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about, how do I respond to truth? And when I respond to truth, am I going to double guess myself, or am I going to do what I know is right and proper, even though it might result in a reaction that's not favorable, because that's not what I'm doing it for. It's kind of like, it reminds me too about, you know, that story when David comes back from battle and starts dancing, and he dances so hard his clothes come off. It's kind of like that. David didn't go out and dance to be showy. David didn't dance to get naked. David danced because he was passionate about what God had done. Just so happened that his clothes weren't fastened well enough to hold everything on. But, you know, and he obviously got to be chastised for that and so on. But, you know, it's kind of like that. It's like, you know, I'm going to do the right thing.
Funny story.
Yeah.
Funny story.
And this is where, you know, the whole Judas versus Mary thing. Judas was trying to be a stickler to the letter of the law. Mary was responding out of a pure move that came from her innards, a complete move of passion and love and joy, and yet grieving that she had to do that. She had to do that. there was no showiness in it. It was simply, I've got to. And so, yeah, we've got this really, really interesting thing to ponder about our responses and how we move out of truth and what that means.
Mm.
What a powerful, powerful story.
Yeah, I like all that.
It's so good.
There's something I really want to say. There's power in tears here.
Yeah.
I really want to affirm this as a good, deeply, deeply human, yet and as a result, radically spiritual act on her part. She's in a world where no one else has listened. And yet she's willing to engage at the very deepest level of who she is with what she has heard. And it's beautiful. And I think that there's a persecution element here that really is just misunderstanding. She is seeing the path Jesus is taking, perhaps not understanding it fully, but she is understanding it much more than Judas and perhaps some of the other disciples around her.
Yeah.
And as a result of seeing something everyone else struggles to, she's found herself, we can call this persecuted, but we can also say that Mary is just what the kingdom of God has opened up to her is not seen by others. And so she looks strange at this point. She looks a little bit odd. She looks a little bit like maybe unhinged even. And I wonder if this somehow helps us understand persecution. What if it is that for some reason we are able to see the kingdom of God and others are yet to? And maybe that's where this, this sense of Christians being misunderstood is a better way of talking about it than that we're persecuted for no reason. We are actually, when I read the Gospels, I find myself thinking, this is God in human form performing life out of perfect love in an unloving world and asking us to begin to perform out of perfect love in an unloving world as well. So this is in a kind of a nutshell here in this gospel reading, Mary is performing out of love and others don't understand it. And that should come as no surprise to us.
Yeah.
This is the story of Easter, that God comes in perfect, perfect love, willing to suffer for this love. But the context is an unloving world. And the result is we take out perfect love. We go and attack it. It's that threatening to humanity. And of course, the resurrection really is not, it's not Jesus coming back and, hey, I'm stronger than you. This is me, Mark II, and I'm going to take you out. This is God's absolute grace and miracle, always sustaining life, always going for resurrection, saying, but even where you take this path, I'm not going to take revenge. I'm going to offer life through it.
Yeah.
It is this completely different story, which I probably say every Wednesday evening. But this story is so different to any of the stories we dare tell about us and the meaning of life. It is so different, which is why I think it takes a lifetime of Lent to actually begin to grasp how different this story is that you and I are learning to live by.
So much to chew this week. Boy, oh boy. Lent 5. Lent 5.
Lent
Well,
5
friends,
done.
well, I don't think it is. I think it's hanging around for a little bit. No, that's it. That's it. As always, you can find articles over at Mark's blog, barefootfollower.life. You can find the Instagram posts. Please watch the YouTube video if you want to as well. It's exactly the same as what you just listened to, or listen to the podcast. It's exactly the same as what you just watched. But we'd love for you to put your comments on all those places and tell us how you've seen these stories, how you're sharing these stories, how you're preaching these stories, and of course, how you're living into these stories as you come out of each Sunday. So we will see you again next week for Lent 6, the 6th Sunday in Lent, getting very close to Easter. It's coming up super fast. But please make sure that you're having conversation with us, because we love to have the conversation with you, and certainly appreciate the thoughts and comments and things that come through in direct messages and comments and emails and stuff over the last 14 or 15 weeks or whatever it's been. I can't remember now.
We've been going for a little while.
Been going for a little while. That's it. So there you go. That's Lent 5. Bless you all. Thank you for your time, Mark, tonight.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Great to talk once again.
Always is. And as always, we'll see you next Wednesday for another Between Two Sundays. Until then, it's bye from us. See you later.
See ya.